All righty then. Hello, 25 October. An interesting month so far. The election continues. Trying out a new title page, so to speak, and thank you to James for that. Uh, it's probably more intelligible in terms of including the web page, autonomouscollective.net. So welcome to Dis and Dat. Dis and Dat comes to you well in the news schedule Monday through Saturday, except this coming Saturday, whereupon we're completing the 3-hour class with the People's Forum on the history of China, the 75th anniversary of the revolution. But after that, my assumption is that there'll be 6 days a week of this and that, and weekly marks on Sundays at 3. Alrighty then. To introduce this, even though probably no one else recognizes that there is a new copy of or new version, a new edition of Capital, Volume 1 by Marx, edited by and translated by Paul Ryder, and edited by Paul North, Paul 1 and Paul 2, and there's a preface by Wendy Brown and an afterword by William Clare Roberts. Needless to say, this is the humanist version of this in the sense that none of these folks are political economists, so it has a certain point of view. There's an audiobook sample that was available on YouTube, which got through most of the preface. In case you wanted to listen to a sample of it, that's the one link here for YouTube. The second link is the reader, and I can read a little bit from that just simply to it. This is in the preface, page 24. There are 944 pages within. If you, it's possible perhaps there's some discounts at Princeton University Press's website for the ebook. The version here on Google is to buy at $31.16. I think I bought my copy at $24 or $27 or something. So I have one, aside from using their clunky reader. I may use that in subsequent beginnings of the text itself and use their text-to-speech reader. So anyway, maybe I'll continue for a few minutes in the preface. As I said, we're sort of almost to the end of it. Capital also requires theory because it simultaneously massifies and disperses. It socializes the productive process and implicitly collectivizes labor, yet it produces and depends upon a distinctly atomized form of freedom, one in which the worker is free to dispense of their own labor power and is thrown on their own means, that is, wages for survival. As proletarianization emancipates workers from overt control by feudal or slave masters, and bourgeois revolutions enfranchise them as citizens with rights, they are not only freed from servitude and formal political subjugation, but emancipated from all forms of dependence and protection. The free circulation of capital and labor and the emergence of commodity-based survival breaks up forms of association that provisioned life through interdependence, producing atomized consumer society in its stead. That's kind of where we are now. This freedom, however, is installed within a machinery of capitalist domination, one that evades control even by the wealthy and powerful. The atomization makes possible the domination. The domination produces the atomization. Freedom is essential to their co-production. Such an operation of power is historically novel, and as with the many separations and divisions in political economy, is what theory brings to light. Thus, more than a century before Michel Foucault launched his critique of sovereign power as political theory's monarchical hangover, spied the importance of massification combined with separation, omnes et singulatim, and formulated powers, circulating operations, and irrigating effects. Marx grasped all three aspects of power. He discovered capital's great and intricate operations in processes, relations, and circulation, and in a structure of atomization and dispersion amidst social massification and dynamic powers vastly exceeding any institutional or individual control. While capital's power appears as an attribute of individuals, that is, capitalists, and objects, that is, commodities and wealth, for Marx, these are but its effects. Moreover, while capital draws succor from states and organizes state institutions and conduct, it neither originates nor settles in state sovereignty, and it itself behaves in a non-sovereign modality. Hence again, the importance of abstractions: value, reification, fetishism, congealment, socially necessary labor time, and more, and of tracking the separations and partitions among related processes to cracking the code of capital. If capital separations and atomizations simulate its power, they also carry revolutionary promise, both theoretical and practical. The theoretical promise is that in capital's unprecedented organized multiplicity of people united by the absence of community, by separation, and by individuality, for the first time, the secret of production, and with it the secret of history, can be made manifest. As we learn to look behind the dramatis personae of power that distract even the most politically savvy, and who litter Marx's work so that he can reveal their puppet strings, we finally see political economy for what it is, namely modes of production, featuring relations and forces that animate history and that organize social and political orders, dominating us until and unless we develop a new mode featuring collective ownership and control, slavery with extra steps. Put differently, on Marx's account, capital's opaque surfaces, where reifications and fetishisms are in play, signal an order of political economy that is ripened into a totality, one comprising these unseeable relations and forces whose effects are unprecedented and are really only graspable theoretically. This is the complex truth into which Marx inducts his readers in the book's first half. We're talking about Capital, Volume 1. It is a truth that features a disjunction between how capital appears and how it actually works as a disjunction produced by capital itself, and as an explanation for the failures of previous political economists. In Marx's own words, as accepted modes of thought, forms of appearance are reproduced spontaneously and without mediation, while their hidden underpinnings have to be discovered by science and scholarship. Classical political economy has come close to stumbling onto this true state of affairs, but it hasn't consciously formulated what it has found, and won't, as long as it remains in its bourgeois skin. And the practical revolutionary promise: apprehension of capitalism's predicates and drives, relations and circulations, points to a practical overcoming of what has been pulled apart, of a massified productive force organized as dispersed human powerlessness, of the reifications and fetishisms of capitalism, along with its salient social features: exploitation, alienation, living to work rather than working to live, and ubiquitous domination by a machinery under no one's control. Concretely, there is a connection across divided spheres and separated activities, cooperation hovering just below the atomization, and the great vulnerability of capital to organize resistance from labor, its source of sustenance. The workers unite not merely to redistribute wealth, but to suture estranged spheres of activity and reconnect life with work, workers with one another, production with need, humans with the powers that they have unleashed in the world. At this point, what was mystified becomes transparent, and theory no longer has to struggle with so much. The religious mirroring of the real world won't vanish until the workaday world's practical relations become consistently transparent, rational relations among people and between people and nature. The form of the social life process, i.e., the material production process, will not shed its foggy shroud of mystery until it becomes the product of freely associated people, planned and controlled by them. The world we inhabit today is unimaginable without capital, but also without capital, the book. This is not because the former is responsible for everything, nothing is, or because the latter captured every power shaping this world, nothing does. Rather, Marx revealed capital as the first global mode of production, a world historical force featuring unprecedented powers, unharnessable drives, and a peculiar set of freedoms enabling unprecedented domination of peoples and earth. Because Marx understood modes of production as far more than economic arrangements, indeed as conditioning histories, humans, and all their social relations and institutions, this revelation was profound beyond measure. Leaving aside the fantasy of a perfectly rational, controlled, and transparent communist political economy on the far side of a capitalist epoch, the brilliance and enduring relevance of Marx's Anatomy of Capitalism rest in his formulating of its object as at once singularly theoretical and material, as human-made yet beyond human control, with more power to set the conditions for all planetary life than anything the species has ever unleashed. Capital and Capital the book forever changed worldly imaginaries as they changed Marx's own. Both also set permanent intellectual tasks before us, including that of developing and revising Marx's thought, to take the measure of capital's complex iterations and transmogrifications in the century and a half since he wrote. To name but the most obvious of these, there is the rise and fall of the regulatory and social state and of the middle and professional classes. There is the growth of the corporation, and with it, transformations in the nature of ownership, management, and stratifications among workers exceeding anything Marx imagined. There is the rise of finance with its radical transformations in the production and concentration of wealth, in class formation and reproduction, and the relation of private and public capital and states. There is the emergence of thousands of autonomous economic zones that perforate the conventional economic and political fabric of nation states. There is globally disseminated production, and with it, new iterations of the racial stratifications accompanying capital accumulation since its inception. There is the always partial commodification of care work, which, as it moves from household to market, remakes gender, kinship, and family forms. There is the supplementation of commodity production by the service, information, and platform economies, and the transformations of capital and labor each entails. And there is what Marx termed the free gift of nature, giving way to widespread recognition of planetary finitude and fragility, a recognition incited by catastrophic climate change and species extinction chains. These and other developments, as well as capital's proven ability to remake itself in relation to various regimes, technologies, political demands, and opportunities, render Marx's great work anachronistic. If, for example, the labor theory of value no longer explains the production of all wealth, or the crisis of the planet today rivals human misery and injustice as an indictment of capitalism, should we still read the book? This question returns us once more to the importance of understanding Capital the book as a critical theory of political economy and capitalist political economy itself, as a philosophical object revealed by critical theory. It returns us as well to capital separations, this time considered ontologically and epistemologically. In his introduction to this text, North reminds us that the term capital, quote unquote, descends from the Latin capitalis and Middle English caput, both of which meant head and were linked to owned wealth, originally in the form of heads of cattle. In the framework of the classical political economists whom Marx takes to task, capital/head and labor/body are radically separated and autonomous from each other. Some people would also, well, let me break here and just say that in certain constructions during that time period, the 16th and 17th and 18th century, it's quite possible to form a head-body distinction and the heart as being where the mind is. So that's one point of view. All right, back to the read. This separation and imagined autonomy are replicated in the capitalist factory, in the relation between boss, that is the head, and workers, bodies, and again in the separation of production from exchange. Laboring bodies produce the value of commodities, but in the market, Marx says, they have value only in relation to each other, like talking heads. Heads cut off from bodies is also the framework through which Marx reflects on the history of the division of labor, which only becomes truly such from the moment when a division of material and mental labor appears. And it is how Marx theorizes the relation of the bourgeois state to civil society, identifying the former, the bourgeois state, with idealism in both senses of the word, and the latter, civil society, with material life. The material ideal relation in this realm reiterates and consecrates the mystifications of the capital labor and head-body relation in political economy. A head-body estrangement and inversion are thus everywhere in capitalist societies and everywhere part of the problematic that capital theorizes. Born from and sustained by labor, capital appears separate and self-made, and it makes an entire order in this image. Circulations of commodities, money, and capital in markets appear detached from the lives, labor, and production that generated them. Divisions of state from civil society, producer from producers, production from exchange, wage worker from socialized production, everywhere the body and head are separated and their relations of dependency inverted or disavowed. The head-body figure is not one on which Marx dwells, yet everything in his analysis follows from it. From his mocking personifications of the capitalist strutting self-importantly around the factory without understanding what produces his wealth, Elon, to the narratives of the misery of the English working class, to commodity fetishism where relations among humans metamorphose into fantastical relations among things. It is also present in Marx's account of capital itself as both a critical theoretical object, the head can only be explained through the body that keeps it alive, and a revolutionary object, the head must be cut off. Materialist critique returns again and again to life-giving bodies, disavowed by heads that subordinate, exploit, and plunder them. The language of alienation and estrangement, far from essentialist, invokes this predicament, this deep ontological and epistemological critique of capitalism and its political, cultural, and practical detachment from the many forms of life it saps or destroys, harbors the continued relevance of Marx's work to two of the most significant challenges of late modernity, that is, financialization and ecological catastrophe. Who'd have thought? Financialization today ransacks housing, healthcare, childcare, education, union-protected jobs, farming, neighborhoods, fragile lands and waters, and more. It does so not through commodification, but speculative monetization. Asset managers, private equity funds, real estate investment trusts, and continually proliferating derivatives, not to mention debt financing of everything from states to schools, intensifies capital's predation on life and its spectacular production of inequalities as they consolidate remote investors into vampiric powers feasting on the blood of anything for short-term returns. Human needs, toxic production and extraction, poor regions or states, natural or unnatural catastrophes, other financial institutions, even healthy capitalist entities brought to quick death after being drained of their value, all are game in the world of finance, a world that entangles everyone and everything in its webs. Or, to return to the head-body metaphor, with finance, capital has grown yet another head, this one more monstrous than anything Marx imagined in its detachment from the earthly life whose blood it sucks. And what light might capital shed on the planetary ecological catastrophe unfolding in the 21st century? Especially since Marx joined his contemporaries in differentiating humans from nature and followed Aristotle and Hegel in casting us as bound to incessantly transform nature for our own comfort and benefit. Capital's voraciousness for profit, its growth through production for consumption or financialization of assets, and its wanton indifference to anything without exchange value, these are obvious drivers of climate change, species collapse, fouled lands and waters. Again, however, capital's head-body ontology also shapes politics, social relations, knowledges, and subjectivities everywhere. Life cast as an instrumentalizable, exploitable resource, which is at the heart of capital accumulation, becomes a feature of general consciousness and general practice. Quotidian existence, indifferent to conditions for a thriving planet, arises from capital's production of our estrangement from what sustains life, both human and non-human. Just as commodities in the market do not announce the social relations that produce them, they do not carry on their surfaces the violations of earthly life through which they're constructed, transported, used, and eventually shed as waste. Consequently, throughout most of capital's reign on earth, few have been alert to the enormous ecological costs of its wanton practices of extraction, production, consumption, and disposal. As capital's cleaved processes, atomizations, and radical disavowals become features of consciousness, as all in its orbit detach from the provenance and processes of the multiple products sustaining them, as the head everywhere separates from and exploits the body, the well-being of earthly life is an inevitable casualty. This problem was not a primary focus for Marx, even if he eyes it when discussing the depleted fertility of the soil affected by large-scale agriculture. More important in analyzing and addressing our 21st century ecological predicament are his critical theoretical notions of estrangement and reification, of a head that imagines independence of the body that bears it, and of capital's relentless expansion and growth drives, which together produce new needs along with new devastations of all earthly life. Finally, why a new translation of this singular work, that is, Capital, Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1. Professors Paul North and Paul Reiter, the two Pauls, have provided a text in English that is exceptionally faithful to the original yet elegant and contemporary. Reiter's translation features Marx's creativity, inventiveness, humor, and literary style, and makes bold the struggle to invent a grammar and vocabulary apt to capital's singularities. Above all, the translation captures Marx's theoretical effort to render the worlds of capital strange and estranging, even as it had already in his time, and all the more so in ours, become familiar and commonsensical. Sorry, I skipped ahead. This making strange of a familiar order by thinking it at once apart from and in critical relation to its self-representation is one of the most extraordinary accomplishments of Marx's critique of political economy. For having rendered that accomplishment in a different language and era with accuracy, lilt, and grace, and for providing splendid explanatory notes, generations of students and scholars will be indeed indebted to Paul North and Paul Reiter. So the next two things are, by the heretofore mentioned editors and translator, is the section on that. Now, as far as yammering here in this and that, we're now at, about half hour into what we've been yammering here. Let me point out that what I've done today is on the this and that page, aside with new illustration, I've included a connection to the audiobook sample, which goes about 20 some odd pages in, on Wendy Roberts' preface. So if you wanted to get a sense of that in the audio, you can get that for free on Google, at least as a teaser. The second thing, which is what I was reading from just now, is the continuance of that preface in Google Play, which is free. This is that same little piece from Google. I've included the video from the Ideas podcast from Princeton University Press. It's quite short. A much longer, hour and a half little visit with the two Pauls. Paul 1 on the left. Well, actually, Paul 1 is on the right, and Paul 2 is on the left. There is a audio podcast dialogue, which also goes for about an hour plus, with the two Pauls. The other thing that I put on the This and That page today is something which I will make a comment on, and maybe for the last couple of minutes I will go back and we will start the editor's notes. Yes, there's tons of that, but every translation has the front end. And I have this goal on the weekend in terms of audiobooks, etc., to have the text-to-speech reader from the Princeton University Press site and do that within weekly marks. So, it's just an hour, for weekly marks, or hour plus, and it might not get us very far, but in the spirit of weekly marks, we might actually get through the first 10 pages of the new translation of Marx's Capital One, read from text to speech in this particular context. Okay, today, and it was interesting because we've been talking about this before, is this idea of who counts as a class, and what is the difference if we think about classes, the proletariat who actually work and labor, and the bourgeoisie who don't really do much, and we tackled at least in part, the productive versus unproductive distinction being made in terms of producing capital and utilizing labor. Today, the Reuters announced, because they follow, of course, the British government as well, announced that Britons who own shares or property, that is, if you own some land or stock, you can be considered a working person. Now, that sort of doesn't quite fit with what we might really think about these class divisions, but it is quite amusing because it is sort of that new labor thing, or new labor. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's office clarified after he suggested they wouldn't fit his definition of the phrase ahead of a budget next week. So needless to say, all the things that we've been talking about still come to the fore. Who actually works, what counts as labor, what counts as capital. As the government warns, it will need to take difficult decisions at the October 30th budget to raise revenue. Ministers have repeatedly sought to reassure voters by saying working people won't be hit by tax increases. And, you can see the semantic jungle there. And as pointed out in an article in the London Review of Books, which I've included in its entirety below, it's a one that includes a little thing on Brett Christopher's work, among others. And financing represents the ultimate choke point. And we've been looking at that in the context of modern money theory. So anyway, I included the Reuters link, and how it will be just amusing how people will comment on what counts as a working person. I included a review from the London Review of Books by a review by William Davies, Anti-Market Capitalism Decarbonized. And so I included a couple of paragraphs from this in the thing that I'm doing in Daily Kos on Sunday on in the anti-capitalist meetup. which I think I'm going to do on the carbonization issue and carbon markets, as I keep yammering about over there, partially because it's just necessary. It doesn't get yacked about enough. And so let me read a little bit from this because I think this can fill out our time. And I obviously have the link here so you can go read the whole review itself, which is quite good on the issue of the environment, among other things. William Davies, London Review of Books from a couple weeks ago. The words market and capitalism are frequently used as if they were synonymous, especially where someone is defending the free market. It is generally understood that they're also making an argument for capitalism itself. Yet the two terms can also denote very different sets of institutions and logics. According to the taxonomy developed by the economic historian Fernand Braudel, they may be even opposed to each other. In Braudel's analogy, long phases of economic history are layered one on top of another, like the stories of a house. This is the longue durée of Annales history, the French Annales history. Anyway, like the stories of a house, at the bottom is material life, an opaque world of basic consumption, production, and reproduction. Above this sits economic life, the world of markets, in which people encounter one another as equals in relations of exchange, but also as potential competitors. Markets are characterized by transparency, that is, prices are public, and all relevant activity is visible to everyone. And because of competition, profits are minimal, little more than a wage for the seller. Sitting on top of economic life is capitalism. This, as Braudel sees it, is the zone of the anti-market, a world of opacity, monopoly, concentration of power and wealth, and the kinds of exceptional profit that can be achieved only by escaping the norms of economic life. Market traders engage with one another at a designated time and place, abiding by shared rules. Think of a town square on market day, the agora. Capitalists exploit their unrivaled control over time and space in order to impose their rules on everyone else. Think of Wall Street. Buyers and sellers on eBay are participating in a market. eBay Inc. is participating in capitalism. Capitalism, in Braudel's words, is where the great predators roam and the law of the jungle operates. On this account, economic life was already established in early modern societies or pre-industrial societies, but capitalism triumphed late, becoming fully dominant only in the 19th century, once it had conscripted the state as its ally. A range of legal, financial, and managerial constructs emerged to protect capitalists and their profits from the kinds of equality and competition that continued to constrain the petite bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, and local traders. Intellectual property, limited liability, a lender of last resort, colonial expansion, and new techniques of disciplining the working class created conditions apt for extraction and exploitation, not mere exchange. The moral and political virtues of markets, as they had appeared to the likes of Adam Smith, were overwhelmed in the capitalist era of Rockefeller and Ford. Why then have capitalism and markets so often been conflated? One explanation is that capitalism undoubtedly requires markets. These markets existed before capitalism, remember, but they are peculiar ones which smuggle in forms of inequality under the veneer of free exchange. According to Marxists, the one market that capitalism cannot do without is the labor market, the institution which magically turns innate human powers into a thing to be bought and sold like apples and oranges. Others, influenced more by Keynes, emphasize the dependence of capitalism on financial markets, in which pieces of paper, bonds, equities, derivatives, etc., change hands on the expectation that they will rise or fall in value in the future. Neither of these is a normal market. What both of them make possible is for a class of people, that is, capitalists, to get rich without doing very much. In the first case, by underpaying their workers, and in the second, by tinkering with balance sheets. Markets for labor and financial assets might appear to be like markets for bread or socks, but they belong firmly in, and indeed enable, the murky hierarchical world of capitalism. not the transparent, egalitarian space of economic life. A second explanation for the conflation of markets and capitalism is that capitalism, unlike the existence of markets, is extremely difficult to justify on its own terms. A simple market transaction has the social value of bringing strangers together for some mutual benefit. 3-hour tour, with neither having got the better of the other. Fair trade is a contemporary appeal to this principle. But by what moral logic does the owner of company shares, a piece of real estate, or care home have the right to become 10 or 15% richer over the course of a year despite not having expended any effort or ingenuity increasing the value of the asset concerned? Liberal economists would respond by distinguishing profits that reflect productivity enhancements and are therefore good from those that reflect market power and are therefore bad. But in practice, the distinction is extremely hard to draw and even harder to police. The most vigorous defenders of capitalism will typically accept the charge that it is monopolistic, exploitative, and opaque, but will also claim that these conditions are required in order that a heroic minority, namely entrepreneurs, remember venture capitalists, can emerge and thrive. This story just about holds together when we're talking about rare cases such as Steve Jobs, but falls apart when it comes into contact with the ordinary reality of MBA wielding CEOs and asset managers who earn 100 times the average wage and call it their compensation. Liberal ideology has tended to duck the problem of capitalism altogether, opting instead to imagine that the economic life, that is, economic egalitarian market, still rules the roost. This myopia is manifest in the economics curricula of major universities, which, despite the best efforts of various campaigns and the Soros-funded Institute for New Economic Thinking, El Horror, have continued to exclude theories which emphasize power, uncertainty, monopoly, and instability, and clung to an orthodoxy in which economic activity is chiefly determined by prices and incentives. Politicians, meanwhile, cleave to liberal fairy tales about making work pay, social mobility, and ownership for all, which are increasingly divorced from a reality of in-work poverty, unearned wealth, and spiraling rents. And financial services masquerade as just another sector among many, selling their wares in a marketplace like humble shopkeepers. Brett Christophers in The Price is Wrong adds to this list a potentially more drastic symptom, a failure on the part of the policymakers to understand the energy transition on which the future of the planet hinges. The operating assumption of energy economists over the years has been that the key obstacle to the growth of renewable energy is its higher cost, which renders it unable to compete against fossil fuels in the energy market and hence reliant on government subsidy. It was a moment of great excitement, therefore, when in 2015, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, reported that finally, renewable technologies, primarily solar and wind farms, were no longer cost outliers relative to gas, coal, oil, and nuclear power generation. According to policy orthodoxy, that should have been a turning point. It should have been the moment when governments could withdraw their subsidies for the renewable sector and stand back as the price mechanisms worked its magic. If coal, gas, and oil were now the least or the less price competitive option, the laws of supply and demand would suggest that they would soon be left for dead. But none of this happened. Why? In a word, profitability. That's Wales Sawan, the CEO of Shell, put it only last year. Our shareholders deserve to see us going after strong returns. If we cannot achieve the double-digit returns in a business, we need to question very hard whether we should continue in that business. Absolutely, we want to go for lower and lower and lower carbon, but it has to be profitable. Companies such as Shell expect to make at least 15% returns on their investments in fossil fuels, but only 5 to 8% returns on their investment in renewables. Why is that? The appeal of fossil fuels from the vantage point of the anti-market is that they continue to offer the kinds of monopoly rent that the far more competitive, more marketized industry of renewables does not. This, as Brett Christopher sees it, is the awkward reality that the paradigm of market economics has hidden from view. He shares the fear expressed by the New Yorker cartoon in which a man explains to three children sitting by some future campfire, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Decarbonization must be carried out on many fronts, but electricity generation is arguably the most important of them. In 2019, 37.5% of global CO2 emissions resulted from electricity generation. The remainder from activities such as transportation, industrial production, and heating. The decarbonization of these activities depends heavily on the promise of electrification, that is, like electrical vehicles. So the need to transform electricity generation is clearly the priority. The challenge is daunting. In 2022, 61% of the global electricity supply came from fossil fuels, the majority from coal, compared to just 12% from wind and solar combined. To keep pace with rising demand, new coal-fueled power stations are being built all the time. An average of 2 per week are approved in China alone. The IEA's plan to reach net zero by 2050 involves a rise in the contribution of wind and solar to 68%, and the virtual eradication of fossil fuels and electricity generation, with the remainder made up by renewables such as hydropower and bioenergy, as well as nuclear. Given that global electricity demand is likely to double over the same period, thanks especially to the electrification of other technologies, the task would appear almost impossible. But to the extent that there is any hope at all of preventing a rise in global temperatures of 2 or more degrees Celsius, it hangs on the rolling out of new wind and solar farms at extraordinary speed. Now, whether or not that can be achieved depends on the capacity of existing political and economic institutions to facilitate it. The economics and regulation of electricity generation are extremely complicated, but a few germane elements can be identified, each of which has a bearing on the prospects for rapid decarbonization. First, there's the regulatory environment that has become the norm across most of the global north since the 1980s. Policymakers influenced by the revival of neoclassical economics and free market ideologies have set about restructuring their energy sectors in the hope that market competition will drive down prices, benefit consumers, and force producers to invest in superior technologies and services in order to sustain their market share and profitability. This is a win-win version of economic life in which markets are sovereign, transparency reigns, and nobody gets to bully anybody else. So it goes on further and asks many questions, et cetera, et cetera. And I will be doing something on Brett Christopher's book soon, namely because it centers on some stuff I'm fiddling around with. Needless to say, we are in tough times. I think that we can agree on that. I am reaching close to the end of my allocated time. And let me remind you that we're changing schedules soon. 3 to 6 p.m. on Saturday will be devoted somehow, some way, to the People's Forum closing session on the history of China at the 75th anniversary of the revolution. And it usually goes for about 2 hours with a Q&A. There is a material available. You can find it via the Discord channel and et cetera. And on Sunday, that's Saturday, in future Saturdays, 3 p.m. will probably turn into a version of This and That or a subversion of Weekly Marks, so that there will be 2 Weekly Marks, that they will not replicate each other, but perhaps be 1 and 2 consecutively. So the reason why I chose 3 p.m., or generally I tended towards 3 p.m., is to accommodate those who are not necessarily in the U.S. time zone. So that's the reason for the timing or scheduling. In the remainder of the week, This and That will appear one way or the other, whether it's me reading or continuing to have read the because I'm going to get through this thing regardless of whether somebody else starts reading it. Regardless, but and since we can also provide a recording of it, I hope that's useful to you. That it's cheaper than the version than paying actual money, but uh, we may move in that direction, or we may move in other narratives. We still can continue on with City of Courts, variety of other things. Coming later this evening, for those who are here, hoping that we will get eventually to the Twilight Zone. We're not going to have Twilight Zone tonight because of uh, extraordinary conditions in John's new house, and in its place, I didn't realize, and let me apologize, that we might have had a consensus around showing The Bad Seed rather than the movie The Bad Seed, rather than what I suggested only a couple of hours ago to show The Hidden, only because it's one of my favorite things. It has a sci-fi context. It has a detective story context. It's wacky, so it's very. I would urge that it is very Twilight Zone-like because it has the juxtaposition of those many different types of fictional genre. So that would be part of my suggestion. But we can do it some other time, and I don't really care. So that's how we're proceeding. We now have achieved 6 o'clock Eastern time, and let me ask if there are any questions or comments, brickbats, interventions. Um, yes, the new translation is different. So at least we'll be able to read it. And as I say, if you go to the Google thing, you can see a significant amount of it being available in Google Play, without having to pay, whatever X amount of dollars, which is a fair amount of money. And those who like books, the ebook um, uh, uh, is the ebook is available for it, as well as the physical book itself, which is something like 900 pages. So it'll at least hold up a table or prop open a door or some other stuff. We're all righty now. Any comments or questions or brickbats, interventions? No. Hearing none. Let's see, Joe, if you're there, yes. Let us, because Joe has control over this, let me ask Joe to return us to our